Hello, everybody, and welcome to Discourse in Magic. My name is Jonah.
My name is Tyler.
And we are here with a very special guest, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about how we met many years ago, but I just want to talk all about gambling and all about cheating and the learning that it takes to get there. We're here with the absolute rock star of that area, Jason England. Jason, how are you?
Hi, guys. How are you? I'm doing great.
We're doing super, and really
very excited to be talking.
Talk magic, talk cheating, talk gambling, and things of that nature. Let's start at the very beginning, which is how did you get into this whole thing? How did you get into magic?
Well, it's a story that I've told a couple times before. I occasionally leave out little pieces of it, depending on who I'm talking to, but I'll give you guys the full rundown.
Give us the good one. Yeah, exactly. Give us the good version.
Yeah, well, you guys are, you're magicians, so you get the real long version. When spectators ask me this, I just tell them I walked into a magic shop one day, and that's true. I did just sort of walk in one day. So I got interested, believe it or not, the very first thing I was interested in was blackjack. The reason I was interested in blackjack first is because I don't remember if it was 1987 or 1988 or something like that. Congress passed something called the Native American Gaming Act in the late 80s. And what this did, it did a couple things. But first of all, it allowed Native Americans in the U.S. to operate casinos, Las Vegas style proper casinos. I mean, they'd been having bingo nights and stuff like that, along with Catholic charities that do bingo nights for years. But this allowed them to operate real Las Vegas style gambling halls or casinos. And other states kind of went along with this. So what happened in northern Mississippi, just south of Memphis, Tennessee, is a series of casinos started up there. And in a little town, what was then was barely even a bus stop, a little town called Tunica, Mississippi. They opened a couple of casinos. One of them was called Splash. I believe Splash was the first casino that opened up there. And my grandmother, who lived in Memphis, liked to play blackjack. Now, you have to understand that in 88 or 89, whenever this was happening, I was just finishing high school, so I couldn't gamble in a casino. But I knew she loved to play blackjack, and she and I would sit at her kitchen table and play blackjack. I would deal to her while she played, and then she would go down into the casinos, but I couldn't go with her. And so I decided, you know what, I want to learn a little bit more about this game that she likes so much, because in a couple of years I'll turn 21 and I'll be able to go with her. So I went out and bought a book on blackjack, and it's one of my favorite blackjack books, not just a sentimental favorite, but also, it's actually a really good book, and much of it holds up to this day. So I bought that book. I practiced and started reading about blackjack and gambling and things of that nature. And somewhere along the line, I just walked into a magic shop in my hometown of Knoxville, Tennessee, which is about 375 miles or so from Memphis, where my grandmother lived. Walked into that magic shop. The guy behind the counter was not only a nice guy, but he was a good magic salesman. He wasn't a performing magician. In fact, he was a school teacher in the daytime. So he was an amateur magician, but an excellent amateur magician and a good magic demonstrator. So he, kind of pitched a lot of what we call slum magic. I hate that term, but it's all the $3 and $4 and $5 tricks that are sort of sitting on the upper shelf in the glass display cases. So all the plastic stuff. You guys know what I'm talking about.
And the little booklets that come with them, and it's 175 tricks to do with the little plastic thing you bought.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I bought all that stuff, and
so did we.
I always liked magic. My earliest magic memories actually predate all of this. I used to like to watch the Johnny Carson show.
Okay.
And of course, Carson was a magician, and he had magicians on the show quite often. And I specifically remember being probably 10 or 11 years old, maybe a little earlier than that, maybe 8 or 9 years old. And I was supposed to be in bed, but my dad was awake and I was awake, and I kind of tiptoed halfway down the stairs, and I'm like looking through the banister into where the television area was. So I'm trying to watch the Carson show, like from 50 feet away or whatever. And he heard me and he said, "Hey, come down here." And so I walked down there and he said, "You're supposed to be in bed and you got to go back to bed in just a minute, but you can sit here with me for a few minutes and watch this next thing." And the reason he said that is because Carson had said something about we have a magician on tonight, and he knew it was coming up. So he let me watch that. And all I remember from it, I do not know who the magician was because I was so young and, wouldn't have remembered the name probably anyway. But I remember seeing hands and I remember seeing cards and specifically aces. That's all I remember. I can't tell you what the trick was. Presumably it was some sort of either cutting the aces or some sort of dealing trick or maybe an ace assembly. I don't know. I don't remember that. All I remember is aces and playing cards. But that's my earliest magic memory, is seeing that and going, wow, how does that work? And asking my dad, how does he do that? And of course, my dad didn't have any idea. He's like, I don't know. But that was it. That was my earliest magic memory. I didn't actually act on it until I walked into that magic shop at about 19 years of age. Bought all those cheap things, and I bought all the basic gaffed decks that you can buy in a magic shop if you've got $5 in your pocket. And I learned. I just went from there. And after about 6 months or so, I sort of stuck with the cards, and I think not because I liked them better, but just because they fit in my pocket. And so it was just sort of an exercise in efficiency, although I wasn't doing it on purpose. I think I just sort of stumbled into it, as a lot of people do.
So can you talk a little about the transition from wanting to learn tricks to learning more just techniques?
Absolutely. So curiously, even though I was interested in legitimate gambling techniques, like strategies before magic, cheating never really crossed my mind. I didn't put the two together right away. It wasn't until the latter half of 1990 when I had, first of all, there were two magic shops in Memphis, a bigger city, twice the size of Knoxville. Back then, two brick and mortar magic stores. And so I went to both of them. And in both of those stores, I met really great card magicians that became lifelong friends. Unfortunately, both of those guys are gone now. But one was named Jim Surprise. Jim Surprise was an attorney in Memphis who would spend his Saturdays behind the magic counter just sort of helping out and demonstrating tricks. So Jim showed me the very first real card trick that I think I ever saw. And when I say real card trick, I mean one that used the normal deck of cards, was purely sleight of hand driven, and didn't use any gimmicks. So I walked into this magic shop and he showed me Brother John Hammond's trick, the Twins, from Brother John's Big Yellow Book. Mm-hmm. And you got to remember that all I knew, I hadn't seen sleight of hand magic yet because I was buying magic and you can't buy sleight of hand. So all I knew was the kind of technique that would cause me to cringe today. That's probably all I knew. And so he shows me a trick that used regular cards and it used pure sleight of hand, and it blew me away. And I was like, whoa, what is that? And he said, well, that's a trick that uses sleight of hand, and it's available in this book over here. And he points to the Big Yellow Book, published by Richard Kaufman. And so I bought the book, and I learned the trick in the car because he did tell me the title of it. He said it's called The Twins, and really sort of fell in love with sleight of hand card magic in that moment. So now I have one magic book. It's all sleight of hand and subtlety. Brother John Hammond, big on subtlety, but there's sleight of hand in there also. And so I go home, and that's it for that whole week. I'm reading that book. The next week, I went to the other magic shop just to see what they had to offer. And I met a guy named Richard Oakley. Now, Richard Oakley was probably in his late 50s when I met him. And he was unquestionably the most knowledgeable magician in Memphis. Jim Surprise was a better pure sleight of hand artist, especially with cards. But Richard Oakley had been doing magic longer and knew more about it. He shows me a trick, and he showed me Triumph. And he did it right out of Stars of Magic. And so I see Triumph, and I'm like, wow, what is that? The first thing I thought is, it's a wedge stripper deck. I pick up the deck and I'm trying to turn cards around and strip them out, and it's not working. And I realize, that's not a trick deck. And so now my head just explodes. I have no idea what's going on. And I said, what is that? And he said, well, it's in this book over here. And I'm like, wow, okay, another book with another great trick in it. Who knew, you know?
Yeah.
And so I look at that book. Now that book, I can tell you, was $25. So now I've got 2 magic books. And the next week I had 3, and then I probably didn't go to just buying them one at a time. I started buying them in groups. So I bought the Vernon Chronicles. At that time, there were 3 volumes out. But that, by the way, is the answer to your question, because that's where the gambling stuff came in.
Right.
Okay.
If you read Vernon, he talks about how the gamblers, the cheaters specifically, all had the best techniques. So if you want to learn a false shuffle, learn it from one of those guys, because their lives and their livelihood depends on it.
Right.
And I believed it, and I was like, okay, if he says I've got to read up about cheaters, then I guess I have to. And so I started really paying attention to any time a cheating technique was mentioned. So now I'm home. I'm back in Knoxville, Tennessee. Summer's over. I'm back in school. I'm in college now, reading these books, and I start attending a couple of the Magic Club meetings. There's an IBM ring that's in Knoxville. I went to a couple of those, where I met a guy named Gary Plants. Gary Plants, of course, is a fantastic magician who now lives in Austin, Texas. I walked into the convention. It's my first magic convention, never been to one before, and I see Jim Surprise, this guy that showed me the twins from Memphis.
Oh, that's so cool.
And I rushed over to him because I knew him. I'm like, hey, Jim, it's Jason. How are you? And he said, oh, I'm doing great. I didn't know you were going to be here. And I'm like, yeah, it's my first one. And I said, hey, I got a question for you. Do you know or can you teach me how to do a second deal? Because I've been reading all this Vernon stuff, and he says these techniques are the best. I got to learn this stuff. And Jim said, well, no, I can't. He goes, I mean, I can do an okay second deal, but I'm not great at it. But you'd be much better off going and talking to that guy. And he points, and over on a couch is sitting Gary Plants. Right. He goes, I know Gary, come on, I'll introduce you. So I walk over and I get introduced to Gary, and I told him what I was interested in. And he spends probably, my memory of it is about a half an hour to 45 minutes just showing me every type of false deal you can imagine. Just really blew my mind at how good these techniques could look. And something that Gary and I found out years later is the whole thing is caught on videotape.
No way.
Oh, wow.
So me sitting there talking to him and all of those deals, a guy was filming that. And it's pretty damn close to my entry into the gambling.
Yeah, it's the turning point.
Yeah,
right?
It's caught on video.
That's so cool.
You know, and I had heard a couple of names from people. I had heard about Richard Turner from a few people, and I had heard about Steve Forty, and I had I may have even had their videotapes by this time. And of course, I hadn't met Richard Turner yet, and I hadn't met Steve Forty yet. That would come over a decade later. But I knew just enough to ask the right questions. I just couldn't do any of it. And here's a guy doing it live and doing it fantastically. If you look on that videotape, I think Gary put it on YouTube. I mean, he's phenomenal. This is just a guy sitting in a hotel lobby, you know, dealing cards onto the coffee table while I watched and asked my questions.
And there's something so amazing about that. And there's moments in some of these stories that you shared that I think a lot of magicians have resonated with in their early times of magic. One of them is, you know, when everything you know to be true about a gimmicked deck or gimmicked cards, and then someone does it without, you know, that's something that'll shock you deeper into magic. Or when you think you know what a second deal and a bottom deal is, and then you watch someone do it for real in front of you, and you're like, oh no, this could be a very, very, very fooling move, and things like that shock you deeper into magic, or particularly deeper into whatever the field is. So gambling.
I also love the Triumph story where you're like, I have a solution. It's obviously a stripper deck, and then that gets pulled out from under you, and you're like, oh, there's a whole other world I don't know about.
Yeah, no, you both of you nailed it. I mean, that's the feeling I had was, yes, one of those decks. I know all about those, and then I pick it up.
Yeah.
And
like, what?
Yeah, exactly. And all you've done, of course, is you've just dug yourself a deeper hole that you now have to try to climb out of.
Exactly.
But without knowing the sleight of hand, you don't have the tools to get out of that hole.
Yeah. So let's continue along the journey and talk about how one more thing came into your life, which is Erdnase. I'd love to hear about how that book came into your life and how it's affected your journey.
We got to go back to the Vernon books that I was reading. I probably did not buy a copy of The Expert at the Card Table in that first summer. I mean, maybe I did. I don't remember when I first bought it. I might have bought it because it would have been a cheap paperback available back then. So maybe I bought it then and looked at it a couple times. The thing about The Expert at the Card Table is that a lot of that information is available in later sources. So I didn't say, oh man, I really need a false shuffle. If I needed a false shuffle, I could find it in one of those other books, and they were easier to read. I mean, let's face it, Erdnase is a phenomenal book, but it's not the easiest book to read. So even if I had it, I probably wouldn't have turned to it first because I had these other great books, that came later, all of which, of course, are pointing back to Erdnase, but I didn't realize that at the time. So I would look at Expert Card Technique, and I would look in these Vernon books, and of course I would look in the earlier Vernon books, the Ganson books. I bought all of that stuff that summer. So it wasn't until maybe a year or so of doing magic and reading these Vernon books and seeing that he kept referring back to The Expert at the Card Table. That would have been my first exposure to it, is reading the title in those other books, and then eventually I went, well, I guess I got to look at this book too, and so then
I guess if everyone's talking about it.
if everyone's talking about it, I got to get it. I got to look at it. So I may have even already had it, but at one point I finally just decided to sit down and read it. And I did. And I probably understood, I don't know, half of it. So the magic stuff in Erdnase didn't excite me that much. Some of the moves were cool. I liked the diagonal palm shift because I got big hands. And so it was easier for me to get that working. The shifts were mere curiosities to me. I was like, okay, well, none of this stuff works. I just sort of looked at it like, yeah, good luck with that. So I had the same reaction that a lot of people had. And I think the only difference is I just kind of kept at it. And I'm not sure why. I wish I could say, here's why. I don't know why I kept at it. But I did.
So let's talk about it a little bit, because that book and a lot of the things that you mentioned hit on some of the points that I was going to say about it. But, it might not be the clearest book ever written about these things. It's not the most modern. So I wonder if that's a book that we should be, using and utilizing, and if it's important, or if it's sort of just a very interesting historical moment. I think of Charles Darwin or like An Origin of Species, and it's like, do we really need to learn that book if we're talking about evolution?
Yeah, or like read Shakespeare to learn English.
Exactly.
Right?
Or have all of the modern people talking about evolution done better and made everything clearer, that we don't have to go back and learn that, and it's just a beautiful piece of history.
Well, I say this all the time to people. I don't use either of those two books, but I tell people all the time that if you wanted to learn geometry, you would probably not pick up
Plato,
Euclid,
right?
And read his book, The Elements. You would probably just turn to a modern, either high school or college geometry book. But every single one of those books owes their existence to Euclid and The Elements. You could do the same thing with anatomy. You're probably not going to turn to a copy of Gray's Anatomy published in the late 1800s. You're going to get a modern anatomy book.
I'm going to watch Gray's Anatomy.
But all of those books, all of these modern texts are all pointing back to these sort of groundbreaking predecessors. So the thing about Erdnase is, it's a terrible first magic book today. In 1902, it might have been a fantastic first magic book.
Right.
But at some point, it's good to know where all this stuff came from. But it's not critical unless you are just interested in the historical
significance of it.
Well, yeah, the historical significance and the historical beginnings of a lot of of a lot of these techniques, at least as far as print goes. Remember, Erdnase didn't invent the magic book. What he did was he improved it.
Right.
And he improved it dramatically. You can pick up magic books that were written pre-Erdnase. You want interested in the second deal? Grab a copy of Sharps and Flats and try to learn the second deal out of there. Good luck.
Right. Because it says take the second card. Or whatever.
Exactly. That's the instruction. Take the second card. Oh, thanks.
Right.
And those books, they have one illustration every 30 pages.
Right.
Something like that. And then Erdnase comes along and he's got one illustration every 2 pages, which is a massive, massive improvement. And these days we might have 10 illustrations, on 2 pages.
Right.
And so he sort of showed us the way, and he created the template for the modern card magic book. So that's his real legacy is that he taught us how to teach magic in books.
Wow.
Amazing.
That's even to just look at it as a piece of history or a better understanding to the roots of everything. That's a beautiful way to look at it. And that's really exciting. The last question I want to ask on the subject of Erdnase before we continue is, I have a feeling that you're the guy who will have the best current answer to the question, who is he? Who is that guy? So what can you tell us from what do we know? 2018, what do we know?
We don't know a lot. So let's talk about confidence in what we know. So we're very confident that the book was published in 1902. We're very confident that it was printed by McKinney and Company in Chicago. And we're very confident that Marshall D. Smith illustrated the book. And we're confident that we found, and I say we, like I did it in the 1940s, but we're confident that we found Marshall D. Smith in the 1940s and interviewed him. And that's about it. That's all that stuff I would bet my life on. And now we start talking about things that I would bet a lot of money on, but I wouldn't bet my life on. Did Marshall Smith meet the author? Well, yeah, probably. I can't prove it, but it certainly seems reasonable that the guy he met was the guy that wrote the book. Other people have speculated that the guy he met wasn't the author, it was just someone else. I think that's a little silly. There was no reason for subterfuge back then as far as meeting the author. So I would bet you almost everything I own that Marshall Smith met the real author. And then other things that we can speculate on. Well, Smith says that he remembers a smaller statured man, a guy in his 40s, maybe a guy that said he was a reformed card cheat and demonstrated some things on a small board and then posed for the illustrations, paid him by a check, a low-numbered check, not necessarily check number 1, as has been reported in the past, but a low-numbered check indicating at least a new account. Maybe some people say it indicates that the guy didn't live in that town. I go, no, it's possible to open a new account in a town you've lived in for 30 years. So, but it does indicate a relatively new account. Paid by check. Marshall Smith said the check cleared. Somehow he got the illustrations back to this guy. Whether they met again or if he just mailed them is unclear. Smith didn't really remember. Remember, we're interviewing him 40 years later. And he seemed to remember that the guy had kind of a northeastern or eastern accent. And he seemed to remember that he mentioned being related to a famous cartoonist of that era named Dalrymple. And that's it. And all of that is a 40-plus-year-old memory.
Right.
So do I believe it? No. Do I disbelieve it? No. I'm just sort of on the fence about whether this guy's 40-year-old memory is accurate. And so I think you have to take all of that with a grain of salt. I mean, you asked me about somebody I met a week ago, and I'm like, pretty white guy, 50 years old. That's all I got. That's all I remember. And I met him a week ago. And so you're asking about something 40 years earlier. Well, he remembered what he remembered, and how much of that memory was accurate and how much of it was fallible.
Who knows?
I think that it's our best starting place. Now, if some of it's incorrect, oh, well, them's the breaks, and it's going to set you back a little bit. But we got nothing but time. Here we are over 100 years later, still looking for the guy. So,
right. And do we have like some sort of narrowed down list of people that we think is, again, I'm saying we as if I had any role in anything.
Yeah, sure. I do it all the
time. Do we have any narrowed down list of any sort that we're like, these are some likely candidates? Or,
well, if you know anything about the search for Erdnase, we know that the book was published under the author's name of S.W. Erdnase. Well, that's not a real name. It doesn't take a genius to figure that out. People speculated it wasn't a real name 100 years ago. You read that backwards and you get E.S. Andrews. Well, hey, Andrews, that's a name, So maybe this E.S. Andrews guy is the real author. So one of the things that I kind of always fall back on is that simple is better. Some people say that's Occam's razor, whatever. Yeah. Simple is better. Simple isn't always accurate. Sometimes the complex solution is the correct one. But if you have to choose between two of them and you have no other reason to choose the simpler of the two until further evidence comes along to convince you to go the other route. So, hey, E.S. Andrews, there's a name. All right, let's start looking for E.S. Andrews. Maybe we'll find a guy sitting on a pile of first edition Erdnases, and that's the guy, So what would be great, it would be to find, kind of matches this description. We don't want somebody that's 80 years old, although, again, Smith's memory could be fallible, so maybe it's that guy. We don't want someone 12 years old. That's pretty clearly not who Smith met. So we want someone that vaguely matches this description, obviously had to have been in Chicago late 1901, early 1902. Guess what? We got that guy. Right. We have that person. His name was Edwin Sumner Andrews. He was in Chicago in that time period, and he's approximately the right age and height and description. Is that the guy? Who knows? I have no idea. But it's a great starting place, and I think this is the candidate we should expend the most energy on because he matches. Yeah, for now. Now, if it turns out that he couldn't read or write, all right, probably not the guy. And there's not just one of them. There's one or two of them. There's a couple of possible candidates. If you extend that age range out, then there's actually, I seem to recall there's like 3 or 4 different E.S. Andrews that, could have been in and around Chicago at that time.
So we're looking at a 1 in 4 or not.
Yeah, or it could be something completely different. Maybe E.S. Andrews is not the right name. Maybe as David Alexander sort of suggested, that it's not just a simple backwards anagram of S.W. Erdnase. Maybe it's a complex anagram where you really got to jiggle these letters around. And maybe it's W.E. Sanders. I don't think that's the case. I think W.E. Sanders isn't. We can't even put the guy in Chicago ever. We can put him near Chicago, and we can get his parents in Chicago. But
so cool.
Yeah, it's so cool.
I feel like I'm watching an episode of Cold Case or something
ago,
like that.
To try to get to the bottom of who this guy might be. So it's cool that we're looking at candidates, and it's also part of the beauty of the whole thing is that we don't know, and we can just keep following the trail until maybe we have.
And as magicians, we have to accept that we don't know something, which is hard for us.
It's
you know what I mean?
I'll tell you, there's other candidates out there. I don't like them nearly as much as I like any E.S. Andrews candidate. But there are other candidates out there. Some people say it was a guy that worked in the printer's office that actually published the book. Are you going to be shocked if a guy that worked in the printing house that printed one of Stephen King's books has a first edition
kept one
on his shelf? Give me a break, It's I just don't think it's strong evidence. I think it's evidence, but if we're going to weight that evidence, I think it's isn't weighted very much at all. It's weak evidence. It's better than nothing. I'll give you that. And I think much stronger evidence is looking for someone named E.S. Andrews that matches this description that was in the neighborhood.
That's awesome, and I think that hopefully satiated people's Erdnase qualms, questions, and feelings. That
at least for now
we get a lot of. At least for now.
But by the way, the place to go if you're interested in that is on the Genie Magazine web forum. There is a thread about Erdnase that began years ago, and it sort of evolved into a thread on the search for the authorship identity.
Oh, wow.
And this thread is massive. I mean, depending on what settings you have on your computer, it could be hundreds of pages long or certainly dozens of pages long. And there's some fantastic stuff in there. But if you could somehow sit through all 100+ pages, you would probably come away knowing as much about the search for the Erdnase authorship question as I do, because that's where a lot of this info comes from. And then it's up to you to decide which stuff you think sounds far-fetched, which stuff you think sounds perfect, and, make up your own mind.
Wow.
But we don't have him, if that's what you're asking. And my guess is we never will.
You think we never will?
Not unless we stumble upon
something huge.
Yeah, I mean, a signed contract with the printer. Okay, fine, that's the guy. Who knows? Short of finding some piece of paper with a signature on it, we're probably never going to know to everyone's satisfaction.
Which is pretty beautiful, if you ask me.
Yeah. By the way, I don't think the guy had any intention of hiding forever. I think he needed to hide in 1902 and maybe for a few years afterwards. So he spells his name backwards and he left it at that.
Right, right. Because he was a card cheat, right? So there's
even some question about that. I actually don't think he was a card cheat. Again, he may or may not have.
Now I'm very interested.
He may or may not have said he was, but he doesn't sound like a dyed-in-the-wool card cheat. He didn't like marked cards. He didn't care for holdouts, and he didn't care for cold decking people, switching the deck.
Right.
And if you asked any card cheat in 1902, hey man, what are your bread and butter moves? They would say marked cards, cold decking, and holding out.
Right.
And so wait a minute, this guy doesn't like any of that stuff. What's going on? Well, there's a couple of possibilities. Maybe he was just weird. Maybe he just didn't like getting caught with evidence on him. Okay, I can see that. But he didn't just say, I don't like these things. He said professional.
They're not
used.
He
said professional cheaters won't have anything to do with these types of things. And that is completely wrong.
Maybe he was just teaching everything he didn't use.
Yeah, well, it's hard to know.
Maybe there was a second edition with all the good stuff coming out and we
just never got it.
It's hard to know, and also no hardcore card cheater, I don't think, would have ever bothered to publish some of those fancy flying packet cuts that he put in there. They just would have stayed away from that. Right. And there's a couple of other things that make you wonder if this guy was a real card cheater. So what I think he is a guy that was interested in cards and probably gambled. Well, we know he gambled if you can believe what he says. He says he bucked the tiger, which means he played faro. He gambled. He got cheated. It sort of stuck in his craw a little bit. It bothered him. He talks about the phrase he uses is the heart-rending jolts to our conceit, or something like that. I don't remember the exact phrase. In other words, it kind of pissed him off that he was the victim of cheating. So he started to learn about it. Eventually became an expert on cheating, at least from the outside.
Right. Okay.
I also don't know that I don't think he was a performing magician. There are 12 tricks in the back of the book. Every single one of them came from somewhere else. So all of them are in print prior to him. So he would see a book and go, I got a better way to do that. And so I think he was kind of exactly what he says he was. He was a guy that got cheated. He started to learn about it because it pissed him off. He becomes this sort of outsider looking in expert on both gambling, or cheating rather, and magic. And eventually he accumulates enough knowledge to publish his own book on the subject and make great strides in doing so. He improved those 12 tricks. And so that's who we're left with. We're left with a guy, I believe, that doesn't really fit neatly into either camp, magician or hardcore cheater. He was a guy that was interested in both, that he was only sort of tangentially interested in, I don't think that's a crazy thing. And so a lot of people say, well, he was clearly not a cheater. We're looking for a magician. And other people say, well, the guy was clearly a card cheater. Look at the first half of that book. If you find a magician, it's the wrong guy. And I'm sitting there going, hang on, there's another option. Yeah. You know.
Yeah. I run a podcast with Jonah. I'm not a full-time magician, so there you go.
There you go.
So let's twist a little bit and talk about gambling. You know, it feels to me like there's a lot less people doing strict gambling techniques right now, and maybe it's because the comparison between what I was reading from things that could actually have been gotten away with in a casino versus now when it's got to be a basement game and things like that. And I also, just in the world of Magic, I'm seeing a lot less hardcore gambling stuff. So do you think that's, am I wrong? Is it a trend we're about to see? Is it, what do you think the situation is with that?
We have no idea how much cheating is going on in casinos. We don't know, because certainly we're catching some of them, and we might be catching most of them, but since we're not catching all of them, we don't exactly know how much is going on. The other thing, and I get this from magicians a lot, is they ask a question, they have a certain perspective that they're coming from in their head that leads them to an answer that could be completely wrong. So I'll give you an example. People look at a move on the card table. Let's say a bottom deal. And a guy says, a cheater showed me this bottom deal once. And you look at it, and it's not very good. Okay? And you think to yourself, the guy showed you that? And you go, yep, he showed me this. This is what he did. And a lot of magicians will walk away from it going, impossible. You'd never get away with that in a game. And they're the ones that are wrong. Because what they've done is they've imagined themselves or someone else being the only cheater at the table, trying to use that bottom deal and get it past 7 other people. What if there's 7 cheaters at the table and they're trying to take off one guy, and you put that one guy all the way to the left of a left-handed, a guy holding the cards in the left hand? It's called a 7 pluck one scenario. And it happens all the time. Right. You have to keep that in mind. So now let's go back to the casino cheating for a second. Are there people walking up to a blackjack table and trying to cheat completely from the outside with zero help? It still happens, but it doesn't happen as often as it used to happen. But what if you have help? What if the dealer's down with it? Okay, so the dealer's not going to report you. They're getting a cut of the money. And what if the floor person's down with it? He or she's getting a cut of the money. So is there still cheating going on in casinos? Well, if you're talking about cheating, conspiracy stuff like this, yeah, it still happens. We arrest about 600 people a year in the state of Nevada for cheating. Wow. 99% of them aren't doing anything very interesting, but a couple of them are doing interesting things. I think it's been about 2 years ago now, there was a couple of dealers arrested, a couple of craps dealers at Caesars here in Las Vegas that had been paying off their friends for years.
I remember probably 10 years ago was one of the first times we met is when you did a workshop in Toronto, and I went, and I was the only kid there. It was a whole bunch of adults wanting to learn how to cheat, and it first of all, it resembled a lot of the things that you talked about with Gary Plants when you're watching him do deals that you didn't even think were possible. So I remember that. And then I remember vividly talking about someone betting a stack of chips, which was a shell, and then that shell being filled by the dealer with like hundreds or something. And then when he won again, he would get that shell back. Are there any other stories that stand out to you as big things that maybe magicians at home would like to hear about, incredible ways that casinos have been scammed?
Okay. Let's not talk about Las Vegas for a second, but we're still talking about a modern casino environment. It takes place on one of those gambling boats that sails out of Miami or Fort Lauderdale. Perfectly legal, been going on for years. It still happens to this day. And these ships are not owned by huge conglomerate companies like Caesars Entertainment Group or MGM Grand or anything like that. They're just owned by people, just regular guys,
Yeah.
So
I got a boat and a poker table.
I got a boat and some slot machines and a couple of blackjack tables, and I've got 20 dealers on staff for me, and we go out every day. That's how I make my money. Yeah. So imagine the two of you own that boat together, and you split the profits at the end of every quarter or whatever, 50-50, right down the middle. Obviously, you got to pay your expenses, you got to pay your employees, you got to pay for gas and boat maintenance, but whatever's left over, you split those profits right down the middle. And now imagine Jonah wants to cheat you.
Okay.
He wants to take some of your profits. How does he do it? Well, he allows a team of cheaters to come on board and rip and tear and do whatever they want. They can kick in gaffed dice. They can put in marked cards. Maybe he sends the guy in surveillance on lunch break and sits up there himself for a few hours.
Right.
That's when the cheaters come in and they win a massive chunk of change on his watch, okay? And that money is basically being funneled out the back door. And then at the end of that,
a cut.
And he gets most of it. He'll give the cheaters 10% of it. So let's say you guys normally chop up, let's say $500,000 every quarter. So each of you gets $250,000 in profits. Well, now let's say we can get $100,000 out the door secretly by these cheaters coming in that you've allowed, and you give them $25,000 of that $100,000, and you keep $75,000. You just gave yourself a 10% raise by allowing that cheating to go on.
It sounds like one of the questions that's pertinent in the questions related to cheating happening in casinos or in setups like that is how many and who is involved. And I think that what you said earlier about, there are some single people who try to sit down and do their worst, but what we're worried about, the real damage that people, that'll go under the radar is when people, everyone's in on it except for Joe, and Joe is just getting absolutely demolished.
Yep. And by the way, I don't want people to go away from this thinking that this is common. I don't mention it because it happens every day. I just mention it because it's possible. It has happened in the past. It will probably happen in the future. And they need to sort of expand their horizons as far as what kind of cheating is going on. Are there still people in basement games cheating all by themselves? Yeah, sure there are. And they're winning a little bit of money here and there. But when these guys team up on people and start targeting individuals that have lots of money, that's when you see the really big scores.
So my last question on gambling before we wrap up is one of a moral question, which is how many times do you find yourself at a table, whether teaching or learning or whatever, from people who have actually done it? Do you have moral rules about maybe talking about it? Do you consider people that actually do it, like Robert, what's your feeling on that sort of thing?
Well, I don't interact very often with anyone that I think is going to go out and cheat at cards. It has happened on a number of occasions, but it's rare. I probably see 150 magicians for every one person that I think, well, this guy might try this in a real game at some point. But I was once sitting on an airplane, leaving Las Vegas, going somewhere. I have no idea where I was going. I don't remember now. And I'm shuffling cards on the tray table from the seat in front of me. A girl sitting next to me, she looks over and says, "What are you doing?" And I get this question a lot. And so I don't remember if I said I'm practicing magic or I'm practicing sleight of hand or something like that. And normally that's the end of it. Sometimes I get asked to show them a trick and I'll show them a quick color change and then I'm back to what I'm doing. But she says, could you show me something? And I said, sure. So what I had been practicing was a push-through shuffle. And so this deck happened to be in new deck order. I picked it up and I just did a false shuffle almost as a demo and respread the cards. And her jaw dropped and she got wide-eyed and stared at it and said, "Do that again." I did it again. Now, she can't see through the back of my left hand, so she had no idea how any of this is happening. She's sitting to my left. And she said, that's amazing. What is that? And so I said, it's just a magic trick. And I was going to leave it at that. That's a magic trick. I'm trying to go back to practicing. I didn't really want to talk to her for 5 hours or whatever. But she said, could you show me that? I'm a blackjack dealer in Vegas. And so I went, really? Where do you deal? And we talked for a few minutes. And so she dug through her purse and pulled out a deck of cards. And she was very interested in that technique. And so I taught her a push-through shuffle on the plane. And she was doing it because, I didn't have to teach her how to shuffle. She knew how to do that. She wasn't interested at all in learning how to shuffle. She just couldn't figure out how I was not shuffling. And so we had this conversation about false shuffles. Because once I found out she's in the gambling world, it didn't feel like revealing a magic secret to me anymore, although I guess it probably was. But I didn't feel like that once she pulled out a deck of cards and told me, hey, I'm a dealer. I kind of understand shuffling. So what the hell was that? I have no idea what happened to her. I don't know her name. For all I know, she went home and concocted some scheme to cheat her casino out of $1 billion. I don't know.
Well, what's so crazy is that we are still giving tools that could be very dangerous. It's akin to a martial artist teaching someone how to kill someone with a strike to this. You know what I mean? Like these are deadly things that people could be using.
Sure. As you know, almost any tool can be repurposed. I don't think the guy at the hardware store feels bad when he sells a hammer. Just because that whoever bought it could go home and kill his wife with it. Any tool can be repurposed. And there's a big difference between going, yes, sir, how can I help you? I'm looking for a hammer to kill my wife. Oh, right over here, sir. They're in aisle 3.
Right this way.
There's a big difference between that and, hey, where are your hammers? Those are in aisle 3. And so most of the time when this stuff comes up, it's not the first scenario. It's the second scenario. It's somebody says, hey, tell me about a push-through shuffle. Okay, here's what I know. Tell me about a bottom deal. All right, here's what I know. Tell me about marked cards. Here's what I know. And the people that have these nefarious intents in mind, you can usually spot them coming a mile away because they're not magicians. They don't talk like magicians. Most of the time they say something or they do something, and in which case I haven't started them on that path or anything. They're already on it.
Right.
And I don't encourage them. I don't say, well, here's how you screw them. Here's the technique.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll talk about the information in a very clinical sort of way. It's like this, I think this looks better than this. But what's funny is the people that would listen to that weren't going to cheat at cards anyway. And the people that aren't going to listen to that were probably already cheating at cards or were going to cheat at cards.
Just not
or planning on it. Yeah.
It's like trying to sit down and have an intellectual conversation with someone about not knocking over liquor stores. It's like they're not listening to you if they're knocking over liquor stores already.
I want to really quickly before we start the wrap up portion, just make sure we do touch on this. You're speaking about education and teaching people, and you have a lot of work that's been put out educating people on specific techniques in Magic and card cheating. For those who don't know, what is it that they can get out of that series that you've put out?
Okay, so real quickly, that series started when Jonathan Boehm and Chris Kenner came to me and said, hey, would you be willing to do a video for us about anything you want to talk about? Second deal, bottom deal, push through shuffle, doesn't matter. We're just looking for content. And so I was like, sure, I'll think of something. So I don't remember what I came up with first, but I came up with something. And so I went over to Jonathan Boehm's house/studio. He was living here in Vegas at the time. And I filmed that download and I didn't think anything about it. And it was successful. People got in touch with me, said, hey, I really like that. You taught it very well. I learned a lot. Are you going to do another one? And I'm thinking, well, I hadn't thought about it. But they saw great success with it, JB and the people at Theory 11. So they asked me to do another one. So I did another one and another one and another one. Before you know it, I did all of these techniques. They came up with the title Foundations. That wasn't me. Because we eventually had enough of them to put on a single DVD. And then I eventually had enough for a Foundations 2 and a Foundations 3. And we're working on material now for Foundations 4 eventually. No, immediate plans, but eventually. And so I just sort of fell into doing these videos, and looking back on it, I'm really proud of the information that's in those videos. I no longer like the look of them. I want to reshoot some of the early ones because they were matched up to the look of the overall Theory 11 website, which at that time was like,
Right.
dark and spooky and, supposed to look cool and stuff like that. You have to kind of look past that and just look at the technique and listen to what I'm saying and watch what I'm doing. So I'm really happy with the instruction. I still think that I'll put them up against any other instructional videos for those techniques. So if you got another bottom deal video out there somewhere, I'd tell you to look at mine. I think there'll be something in it you like. You may not love the whole thing, but there'll be something that you like. Same thing with the pass, same thing with the double. I teach 5 double lifts on the double lift.
The double series is incredible. Completely changed my perspective on that move.
And what I would say for anybody who is wondering whether or not they should get any of these, I dare you to just watch the trailer for these things. Like, just watch the trailer for the pass or the top card cover pass.
Yeah, that's my favorite one, where like the pass has a few problems and the top card cover pass solves those problems. I think it's one of the funniest things.
Yeah. So,
and just on a last note on those videos, I would highly, highly, highly recommend them. I even after that workshop, which was literally 10 years ago, I'm still doing the lessons that you taught in like bottom deals and second deals and passes and things like that. So highly, highly, highly recommended. And we're at the point of the podcast where we have a few wrap-up questions to pull the whole episode together. So the first is a question of the week. So every week, each one of our guests has some sort of question for our audience. It can be a question that they want the people in the audience to ask themselves, or it can be a question that you are ideally trying to poll a group of magicians to find out what they all think about something. So what is your question of the week for the magicians at home?
What do you want to achieve? Because that will tell you what you need to be doing. If you want to be a monster card technician that does bottom deals, center deals, seconds, and all that stuff that I'm interested in, then you should listen to people like me when we talk about this stuff. But you should also listen not just to me, but to people like me. You should own Richard Turner's DVDs. You should own Steve Forte's DVDs and his books. You should read it all, and you should look at all of it, and take as much as you can, and practice as much as you can, and seek these people out when they come near you, or if they go to magic conventions or whatever. If you want to be a coin magician, don't listen to any of those guys. Anyway, you get the point. You need to be paying attention to these people that are experts in whatever field you want to be an expert in, and then find someone else that's already achieved that, and as much as possible, try to follow their path and listen to them. And eventually you'll have enough information to strike out on your own and start, making whatever it is you've chosen yours. But initially, you need to stand on the shoulders of some giants. You just got to figure out who the giants are that you want to be paying attention to.
I love that. And it specifically has the piece of intentionality, which I like, which is, just taking a moment to say, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? Just because there's so many experts in respective fields that you can learn from.
Yeah, if you can narrow down what you're learning is, your path will be much more direct.
Yep.
The next section is similar, but it doesn't have to be a question. We call it the Magic PSA. We've had pieces of advice from believe in yourself to stop doing the banana bandana. What do you think the magic community needs to hear?
Okay, I'll give you something I've told people before. Of all the magicians that I've ever had the pleasure of spending time around, the most interesting of all of them, well, first of all, they're all experts in something, but they were also all experts in something beyond magic. And interesting magicians second. Now, I met them because of magic, but then I found out that they're experts in something else. Talk to Juan Tamariz about Picasso one of these days. And he can talk for 10 hours about Pablo Picasso. And talk to Roberto Joby about wine one of these days, and you find that the guy's an expert on wine. He also speaks a dozen languages, or whatever. So he's an expert on that, and so you find these really fascinating people that are really fascinating in other areas apart from magic. And so I would say be an interesting person first, find something else that you're passionate about, become an expert in that, and use it to shape and mold your magic.
I love that. I think that's fantastic advice, and it also keeps people out of the deep in the wormhole of magic. It's fun to get into it, but keep one hand on the surface. Try to play racquetball or something. I don't know.
Yeah, stay grounded.
Do something.
Well, we've all met magicians at magic conventions or at sessions or whatever, where as long as they've got the magic prop, whether it's cards or coins or whatever, in their hands, they're the most interesting person in the room. The minute you take those things away from them, they either can't talk because they don't have anything else to talk about, or the level of discourse drops dramatically, and suddenly you realize, oh. And the really interesting thing is that being that super smart, well-rounded person that is engaged in the world around you, it makes you a better magician.
Of course, yeah.
You want a great example of this? Look up anything Eric Mead has put on YouTube.
It's all in game.
But look at those great talks where Eric Mead does the needle through the arm. It's kind of like a TED talk, but it wasn't a TED talk. And he's got another one where he talks about the Perseid meteor shower, and it's fascinating stuff. And he makes it, he brings it back to magic each time. But before that, he demonstrates that this is a guy that doesn't just read magic books. Eric reads, and he reads wide, and he reads deep in a lot of subjects. And that's what makes him one of my favorite magicians on the planet.
Speaking of amazing magicians and super interesting people to talk to, that brings us to our next part of the wrap-up section, which we call the endless chain of magicians. So in order to keep the podcast going forever, we have each guest recommend someone we should interview. But who do you think should be an up-and-coming guest?
Have you talked to Bill Kalush?
We have not.
There you go.
Bill Kalush would be perfect.
Beautiful. And the last and final part of the wrap-up segment is a favorite part, which each one of us, all three of us, mentioned something from the episode. So sort of to pull one thing that we think is a take-home point or a message that we think is particularly important. For me, I loved hearing about some of the finer details of the Erdnase stuff. And really, I loved hearing about the approaches and the thoughts about gambling and working as a team that most people aren't thinking about. And to me, I'm not a gambler. I don't plan on cheating anytime soon, but just that knowledge and that information is very exciting. And because I do gambling demonstrations, the more knowledge I have, the more I get to share and talk about it. And that stuff was very cool and stuff I'm going to read and learn more about. Tyler, what about you? What was a highlight?
Similar to what you said, I love the Erdnase and gambling stuff, but specifically about the Erdnase and gambling stuff, I love the idea of the importance of Erdnase that we spoke about, and this idea that you do have to stand on the shoulders of giants, and then you can become one of those giants, and everything is going to become updated, and there's going to be more clear ways of learning, but that doesn't discredit the value of the history of where we came from and the importance of recognizing it. Jason, what about you?
I think the important takeaways are, figure out what you want. That's going to guide you as to, so I think that's probably the most important thing that we've talked about here that will help magicians. It's just,
and I think that's amazing. And I really love that idea of this stuff. While none of it is easy and a lot of these techniques and things like it is difficult, it comes down to practice and choosing what you want to do and doing it and learning from the right resources and continually refining. And I think that is that's one of the big things to remember and to learn. And I love the idea of taking somebody who's doing what you want to be doing or that looks the way that you want to look and doing exactly what they do. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a very beautiful place to wrap up the episode. So the last and final thing just to mention is once again a plug for you guys to go ahead and check out Jason's stuff on Theory 11 because it's really, really fantastic. And so many people ask questions about moves that I have no business teaching, when I meet them, what is the second deal? What is the double lift and pass? I'm like, you learning from me is a mistake, so I have to unlearn everything. So
you're probably doing the double lift wrong.
Yeah, I'm sure.
I will say that.
I'm doing it all wrong. So definitely go and check out Jason's resources. And of course, Jason, I want to give you a big, huge thank you for joining us on the episode. Super, super interesting. And we love having you.
Thank you very much.
And of course, a big thank you to everybody at home for joining us and learning about how to learn and what to learn about. And we will see you all next Thursday.
Take care.